Many of the core concepts that we hold to be essential to the Dungeons and Dragons experience were not actually part of the original rules, but instead debuted over a year later in its first supplement. Join me as I discuss the impact of the Greyhawk supplement today on Daddy Rolled a One. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. Today I'm going to be talking about this book here, Supplement 1, Greyhawk for Dungeons & Dragons, released in 1975. I've talked a little bit about this book before. I've sprinkled bits and pieces of it, parts of the rules and options that were introduced over the course of this book in other videos, but I've never talked about it as a whole, and particularly talking about the impact that this book had on the way that we play Dungeons and Dragons today, because I would venture to say that the rules that are in here, the options that are in here, are the ones that people are more familiar with. And if you're brand new to Dungeons and Dragons, what you see in this book is going to be much more familiar to you than some of the stuff that's in the original 3 books from the original box set of Dungeons and Dragons. So I wanted to talk about that. And, one of my commenters suggested that I should spend a little bit more time, or that, asked if I could spend more time talking about the supplements and their impact on the game. And I thought that was a good idea. So that's what I'm going to do in this particular video. Now, if this kind of history is something that's interesting to you and you enjoy learning about the history of tabletop role-playing games, please make sure to like the video, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and hit the bell icon so you'll be notified when I upload new videos such as this one. So let's dive in and talk about what's in this book. So it says additional, you see that in this kind of italic type, additional rules for fantastic medieval war games campaigns playable with paper and pencil and miniature figures. Now, the use of the word additional here is very interesting because at the time when this was published, it was not all that common to have additional rules added on to an existing game, something like a Monopoly that's been out for 100 years or whatever when it first got published. There are versions of that game now that have, different aesthetics, different settings or whatever. There's Star Wars Monopoly and that kind of thing, but the core rules pretty much play the same. Now, I know there is another one that we have. It's called, I think, Monopoly Builder or something. My daughter got it once before, and you're actually building like 3D structures on the board as well as playing the regular rules. So, but that wasn't added until decades and decades and decades later. But this is coming out only a year after the original publication of the rules, and they're already giving you new options and new ways to play. And again, my point of that is that this was sort of setting the stage for how we were going to approach Dungeons and Dragons, that it was a living organism that was constantly going to be evolving and changing and being, adapting to it. And so that this book alone really sets the stage for how we approach role-playing games all the way now here 50 years later in 2024, as you get supplemental rules all the time for, if you're a 5e player or even 3e, there's constantly books coming out with new feats and new spells and new races and new classes and all that kind of stuff. And again, that was not something that people were kind of used to. So having this come out, although this is really optional, and it tells you in here that these are options or additions, or even sometimes they use the word suggestions. We'll get into the specific language as we get into the book. People sort of approached it as like, no, we're going to take all this stuff and put it into our games. So they didn't necessarily approach it as like a pick and choose, or that they could use the stuff, but they could discard it or not use it at all. Most people ended up using this, and you're going to see that as we go through this and how that impacted the way that we play the game. However, there are some people that take it as a point of pride that they only played this game with the original 3 books, and they don't use the stuff from Greyhawk or any of the other supplements. And they, like I said, they take it as a point of pride. So it's a small group. They can be very vocal, and it is fun to hear them talk about how they played this without access to this and how that changes their approach to Dungeons and Dragons. So, but I started after all of this was kind of already done and passed. So I didn't start until 1981. This comes out in 84, and this came out in 75. So with that said, I kind of just want to talk about what was in this book. So the first thing that we see on here, other than the additional, is this little guy here. So that's a beholder. If you're not, I think it's pretty obvious that that's what it is, but it looks so different from the beholders that we're probably used to now in later editions. But probably one of the most iconic monsters associated with Dungeons and Dragons, and it didn't debut in the original game. It debuted in a supplement. Okay, and then it says, you see here, it says Greyhawk, Gygax, and Kuntz. Now, this is Rob Kuntz. We've talked about him before, but Rob was a friend of Gary's. As I understand it, actually lived within Gary's household for a while and is younger than Gary. So Gary kind of like took Rob under his wing, and Rob really responded to playing Dungeons & Dragons, started running his own mega dungeon called El Rajaki. But he also became, because the Greyhawk, everyone wanted to play in Greyhawk. As Gary was testing, he had so many players that he just couldn't handle DMing them all by himself. And so he brought Rob Kuntz in as a co-DM. And so Rob was designing his own levels in Greyhawk, or in rooms and different parts of it, trips and tracks and traps and monsters and all this kind of stuff. So a lot of the stuff that he worked on ended up informing Greyhawk and becoming part of that campaign setting. So that's why Rob is credited here, even though, most people would say, Greyhawk is Gary Gygax's creation, because it was. And it's really associated with Gary. But I think a lot of people forget that Rob Kuntz had a huge part to do with the development of Greyhawk. And then you see this Lizard Man logo here, published by TSR Rules. So this logo was used by TSR for a while. Originally, it was this one. This is the GK, as we mentioned before. It stands for Gygax and K, K-A-Y-E, who Don K was Gary's friend and one of the initial investors to create Tactical Studies rules. So, but this Lizard Man logo is based on this illustration here. This is the Lizard Man by Greg Bell. Now, Greg Bell, you see his signature there, was a teenager at the time, and he does most of the art in these original books here for the original publication of Dungeons & Dragons 1974, and then does quite a few, if not all of the illustrations here. I don't think it's all of them, but I think it's most of them here in Greyhawk. And as I recall, Greg Bell identified that this Lizard Man drawing was his favorite artwork that he did for TSR. I could be mistaken on that, but I'm pretty sure this is the one he said he was his favorite. And I really like it. I always like this drawing. I love that it's on the inside front cover. It's like you immediately get a sense of like what's going on here, what you're going to be getting into. Okay, but you'll see that this was adapted to become the logo here. I don't really think that was a great choice. I love the Lizard Man logo. It just doesn't reproduce well. You lose all this detail. And the reason you lose detail is because this is almost too detailed to be shrunken down to that level. I mean, look at all these different all the different line work here. Now, Greg Bell has this very striking, very black and white. There's very little shading. He's got some line work here, but he's not using like brush work for shading. There's not a lot of fine detail. It's this very thick, chunky line work that he does, which works really well when you're reproducing something at this size. This looks great, and you can make out the details that you need. But when you reduce this down, I mean, look at the detail on the polearm. You can't even see it versus what you see here. So while I really like this drawing, I don't think it was a good choice for the logo. As much as I like the Lizard Man logo, it's hard. It's hard because I like the original drawing. So you see here, supplement 1, Gary Gygax and Rob Kuntz, and then it says with special thanks to Alan Lucien, Mike Bernard, and Jeff Key for suggestions. And then you see here, I have a very late printing. I have a 10th printing. I forget exactly how many printings of this there are. Obviously, there's at least 10, but that just goes to show you how popular this was, that it went through 10 printings in 3 years. So the original one came out in 1975, and this is from 1978. So, again, you can just kind of tell how popular this was. But let's talk about these names here, these people. So Alan Lucien, and as I understand it, that name is spelled incorrectly. I believe it's supposed to be Lucien, not O-N. So Alan Lucien's credited here. He's credited in the the credits for Chainmail. And he's credited in the first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook. But I think most specifically where people would know his name is from this. This is Tomb of Horrors, Module S1. And this is the later printing with the different cover. The original one was the monochrome cover. It was black and white, and I think it was pinkish colored. They call them monochrome. But there's a credit on here, and it says this module was at the second paragraph. This module was originally used for the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons tournament at Origins. 1. The author wishes to thank Mr. Alan Lucian, who was kind enough to submit some of the ideas for this dungeon. So a lot of people have talked about that over the years. After Gary passed away, rumors started to float on online message boards that Gary had stolen this module from Alan and then repurposed it as as his own, which, as I understand it, is just completely not even close to being true. So what I have heard, so Alan himself, as far as I understand, has no ill will against Gary and has never claimed that Gary stole this module for him. From what I understand, Alan was an early playtester of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So he's from the Sacramento area, a place called Orangevale. And but he, like I said, was an early playtester and created his own adventure that I understand was called the Tomb of Ra-Hotep. So, and it was short. I think it was only like 5 pages. But kind of Gary was inspired by that, this very trap heavy dungeon, to use that as inspiration to create the Tomb of Horrors. So that is the story as I understand it. And again, Alan has never claimed it, from what I can tell, from what I've seen online, has never claimed anything other than that it was inspired by. And so I think that's kind of where he is known for. I don't see too much other stuff that he created post this. It seems like he was sort of one of these people. I don't want to say behind the scenes because he's being name dropped quite a bit, but he sort of seems to just have been there, part of everything happening at the time, play testing things and working things out. People have said he also submitted some spells for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. However, there does not seem to be any consensus as to which spells those were, from what I can find. If anybody knows for sure, go ahead and leave that in the comments. I'd love to learn more about that. Okay, so then the second name mentioned here is Mike Mornard. Now, we've talked about him before. Mike has the distinction of being, from what I understand, again, being the only person who played in all 3 of these core early tabletop role-playing games, which is Gary Gygax's Greyhawk, Dave Arneson's Blackmoor, and Professor M.A.R. Barker's Empire of the Petal Throne. So there were people that kind of moved in between, like, say, 2 of those, depending on which 2. It could have been Greyhawk and Blackmoor. It could have been Blackmoor and Empire of the Petal Throne because they were from the same area, in the Minneapolis Twin Cities area. So 2 of the 3 of those is pretty common, but all 3 seems to be, well, I was going to say rare, but actually seems to be unique to Mike. So Mike is, if you will see him interviewed in the documentary called The Dreams in Gary's Basement. I've talked about that before. You can get it on Blu-ray, and I don't know if it's available for streaming. The way I saw it, it was that you had to buy a physical copy, which is fine. I don't mind owning physical media, as you've seen from my records and comics and obviously games. So that's Mike Mornard. And then the third name there listed is Jeff Key. So we've talked very briefly about Jeff Key before, but the thing is, there's not a lot out there that I could find about him as far as his contributions to role-playing. So in addition to being thanked in here, he's also thanked in the 1977 Holmes Basic Set. And in Dragon Magazine issue number 3, he co-authors the creation of a new character class, an option for the Samurai. And I have talked about that Samurai before. I'll put a link to that video up here, appearing in an early edition or issue of Dragon Magazine. So these are people, again, that I think were just kind of there at the time as far as like playing in the games and probably making suggestions to the folks, either Gary or Dave, that ended up making their way into the game. And those suggestions seem to have kind of been lost in time, but the fact that they're thanked means that they were like instrumental in helping put this together. Okay, so we have that page. And then we're going to just jump in. I'm not going to go over the index really, although it is helpful to have an index in here, but we're going to go to the foreword. And Gary says, one cannot properly introduce a supplement to an existing body of rules which already contain both a foreword and an introduction. Yet it is absolutely necessary to make certain that the prospective buyer understands that this volume cannot stand by itself. It is expressly written to augment the Dungeons and Dragons rule set. And if you do not possess that set, there's no point in buying the supplemental rules alone. However, it does no harm to read further. It is hoped that if you skim through the rules, For the pages that follow, you become so interested as to buy both D&D and this edition. If you enjoy fantasy, you will never be sorry you are introduced to the swords and sorcery of Dungeons and Dragons game. If you already own a set of D&D, then buy this booklet right now. For what is herein adds immeasurably to the existing game. There are new characters, new abilities, more spells to use, a horde of new monsters, heaps of magical treasure, and various additions to the suggestions and rules for adventuring above and below ground. So Gary goes on to say right here that the material in Greyhawk is new rules, additions to existing rules, and suggested changes. So, and then he talks about how it's laid out to kind of map to the original 3 books and what was in each of those. So then he says down here, and I think this is key, fantasy being what it is, it appears that there will never be an end to the development of fresh ideas. And this booklet is what we hope will be the first of a long series of periodic supplements to add to your enjoyment of Dungeons and Dragons. So right out the gate, and I was talking about that earlier, this book sets the stage for how Dungeons and Dragons is going to be presented for the next 50 years. New rules, changes, additions, suggestions, all that kind of stuff. All of that was laid out in this very first supplement as far as the future of Dungeons and Dragons. So I know a lot of people have said, they think that D&D should have stopped developing after first edition and they should have just developed more edition material for that. So first edition in that case, what they mean is Advanced Dungeons and Dragons by Gary. Gary was all fine with doing a revision of the rules to do a second edition. Now, the second edition that we got is nothing like what Gary had worked on and would have proposed, but he was already working on developing things. He was okay with like things such as non-weapon proficiencies. Those came into a book that he listed himself as the author on. That's Oriental Adventures 1985. Well, that book was written by Dave Cook and those were his idea. Gary put his name on it and wouldn't have done so if he didn't agree that those things were okay. So the idea of having this game constantly evolve and come out with new ideas and new things, that's not a bad thing. And, you can't go overboard, of course, by having too much, and things can maybe change to where a lot of people will say D&D now is unrecognizable to the way it was before. I don't really agree with that point of view. While I prefer to play older editions, I don't really think that 5e is so far out of the realm of what the original basis of the game was. Yes, the mechanics are different and the aesthetics are definitely different. And I think a lot of people get confused by that. They mix up the idea of the aesthetics, meaning what species are available, what classes, all that kind of stuff, and the art, the art style. And they mix that and say, oh, well, it doesn't look like anything like D&D was when I was a kid. But at the core of how the rules play and how the mechanics work, it's not horribly different. All right. So anyway, he talks about that. And then there's going to be at least one more supplement coming, which is Dave Arneson's Blackmore. We know that there's going to be more than just one, but that's what he was talking about at the time. Okay. So that's February of 1975. So let's get into this and see what's in here and what we're going to get. So I'm just going to go through it kind of like in order. I'm not going to go, read page by page. That's not the point. I just want to talk about some of the things that came out of this that you might not have been aware were not part of the original rules. So you see characters, additions, and changes, and it says there are now 4 main classes of characters. And I have talked about this before. I have a whole video on the development of the thief, but the thief, or what now people would call rogues, that doesn't come until this book. So originally there were only these 3 classes: fighting men, magic users, and clerics. And then you see in italics, you have thieves, but you also have paladins in italics. Paladins were introduced in this book. And so then it talks about what you're going to get from having those, as far as like certain lawful fighters may opt to become paladins. And so this is a really interesting thing that a lot of people don't necessarily think about with regard to these old rules. But in the original rule booklet here, in Men and Magic, it says that dwarves and hobbits, originally and later changed to halflings, can operate as fighters. So it doesn't say, a lot of people, again, I've talked about this a lot, but a lot of people think that original Dungeons and Dragons is race as class, which is what Moldvay Basic was, and the Menser Basic, or the Beckme line. That's race as class. You play a dwarf or you play an elf. In this game, even though dwarf in these rules even though dwarf can technically only be a fighter or a fighting man, they are a dwarf fighter. You're not just playing a dwarf. And so because you're playing a dwarf fighter, if you had a lawful dwarf fighter here and they were lawful since the outset of their career, they could have become a paladin if they met all the other qualifications. So there was, and I remember reading in Dragon Magazine once, there was at least one known dwarf paladin player from the OD&D game out about running around and adventuring. And so a lot of people thought that wasn't possible because once Advanced Dungeons & Dragons is created, it specifically states that paladins can only be human. But in this particular case, if you kind of skirt around the rules, technically any race that could have been a fighter could have also been a paladin, again, had they been lawful since character creation. All right, but then you have your thieves and the creation of thieves. We've talked all about this before, so I'll link to that other video here as far as like where the thief came from. Now, in that video, I mentioned that it was created by the folks at the Aero Hobbies group out here in Santa Monica, and Gary Switzer, who was the owner of that shop, called Gary Gygax and explained the concept to him over the phone. Gary took notes and then wrote his own version up and published it in the Great Plains Games Players newsletter, where he thanked Gary Switzer. But then later in here, there's no thanks to Gary, as you saw in the beginning here. So it's just at this point, he's just taking it. However, there were thieves in the Blackmoor game as well. Blackmoor didn't really have classes the way that we think of classes. They had roles or archetypes, whatever you want to call. And I want to say that it was Dave McGarry. It's either Dave McGarry or Mark Carr. And I've talked about this before. I interviewed both of them. And so in my head, when I'm not looking at my notes, I tend to conflate their two interviews. I interviewed them at DaveCon back in April. And one of them showed up at a game and was just told by Dave Arneson, like, you're going to play a thief. And there was another player that was playing a merchant that had like a warehouse full of supplies. And the thief character was created specifically to tunnel underneath and steal the supplies, the goods out of the merchant's warehouse. That was part of the game. So he was playing the role of a thief, but without all of the mechanical stuff that we associate with Dungeons and Dragons character classes. But all the stuff that you see here, like opening locks, picking locks, removing traps, listening for noise, move, this list of stuff here were originally thief abilities. That's later going to form the basis for non-weapon proficiencies in later first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, and then really moving into second edition. And that's where skills come from today. So starting in third edition, and then in fifth edition, if your skills and you're good at finding traps or opening locks, things like that, that goes all the way back here, but it didn't exist before that. So, something that you might take for granted skills, one, have not been in the game for that long. And two, they didn't debut in the beginning. They really debut here. I don't like to call these skills because at the time, these were limited to thief characters. So I like to call them the thief abilities to distinguish them from skills, which are things that anybody can do. Okay, but that's just, a little nitpick on the naming there. But this opened up the idea that all of these different races can also be thieves, in addition to being fighting men, or elves being fighting man magic users. So this is opening up the door for any race to be any class, which is what you have in fifth edition. That really started in third edition, where you could have a mixture. You could have a dwarf wizard, which was not possible before that edition of the rules, or a half-orc paladin, or like a half-orc monk, any of those kinds of things, right? Before that, there were restrictions, but this started to open up those restrictions and say that anybody could be a thief. Okay, so that's the thief class. I mean, again, watch that whole other video to get more details on that. But the fourth core class of Dungeons and Dragons did not debut in the original rules. It didn't debut until a year later. Some other things that I think are really interesting in here. I hear a lot of people complain they don't like the concept of race as class, and they think, oh, it's stupid that, dwarves and elves and all those don't have clerics. Like, why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they have priests? Well, they did. And it tells you right here. It says that dwarves, among the dwarves themselves, there are clerics, but not as player characters. only as non-player character types. So dwarf clerics, and they even tells you how high in level they can go and all this kind of stuff. So of course there were going to be people that were going to play dwarf clerics, even though it said that they were for NPCs only. But the idea was the dwarf clerics or the elf clerics, because it does the same thing with elves, they're not adventurers. They're staying home tending to their people. So only human clerics are the ones that are out adventuring, but the other races have them. So, and I think that's a thing that a lot of people get tripped up on in the race as class concept and the way that that's built. The idea is that the archetypal dwarf that you play, because you play a dwarf or you play an elf, those are the adventuring types, which are the ones that you run into as humans. So you associate them all as being the same way, because the game is supposed to be focused on humans. It's human centric. That was part of how those rules were built. And they were built that way for a reason, because they thought players would associate more freely with human type characters, because we're all humans, so we know how to play those. So the idea is that the dwarf that you're seeing that's an adventurer is a specific kind of dwarf that has decided to go out into the wide world and adventure with the other races. But back home in the dwarf homeland, there would be all these other types of things, including clerics. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, the other thing you're going to get in here is half-elves. So this is the first appearance of half-elves in Dungeons and Dragons, and it comes in Greyhawk. So half-elves didn't exist as a player character race in the original rules. So this opens a door, of course, for all the other half races that you're going to have, and the other kind of, expanding the different options that you have. If you have half-elves, then you can have half-orcs. Gary writes a very famous article in Dragon Magazine that I have talked about before, where he talks about, he threw this in there just for, he says, for the sheer madness of the game. And, but then everyone's like, well, can I play a half-dwarf? And can I play a half-halfling? And is a half-halfling a quarterling? And can I play a dwarf elf? And can all these kinds of things, right? And he didn't like that. So he put this in, but then he kind of later on says he kind of regrets doing this because it just opened up too many questions from people of what could mix with what. All right. So, but that is the debut of half-elves. So a core part of the game, half-elves are still in the game now. I know now they treat it differently in the new rules for the 2024 edition, where I think it's more based on ancestry. They don't use the term half-elf anymore, but using the mechanics, you can build what is essentially like a classic half-elf. Okay, so those are kind of the things that are debuting here in this class section. Now, there's some other really interesting things that come out of this, which are the determination of abilities and the ability scores. This is huge. It might not seem like that big of a deal, but this is setting the stage for how we deal with ability scores today. Because remember, if you've seen my video on the history of ability scores, and even if you see my video just recently, I did one on the changes that the Holmes 1977 edition made to the original rules. And I talked about the bonuses and penalties associated with the ability scores. And I mentioned how in here, in these rules, ability scores don't really do a whole bunch. They basically, what they do is associate you with getting more experience points if it's your prime requisite. So fighters get more experience points if they have a high strength. Magic users get more experience points if they have a high intelligence, etc. That's the main thing that ability scores do. It's not until Greyhawk that fighters get a bonus, and it's only fighters. It's not every class. It's only fighters, but fighters get a bonus or penalty to their hit probability, which is your attack roll to hit, and your damage. And of course, the numbers aren't the same, which is very frustrating that they don't stack the same, but they get bonuses or penalties to hit and damage as fighters with high strength or, with very, very low strength. And other characters don't. Other characters don't get that. Okay. And then also, they talk about dexterity. You see the fighters also get exceptional strength, which has gone away. That was part of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, but it's gone away starting with 3rd edition. But they talk about, there's another place in here, and it's in the dexterity section, but fighters get a bonus to their armor class if they have a high dex. And that was something that was created in this edition. So in here, you get a bonus to missile fire with a high dex, but it's in this book that you get the understanding that your armor class is going to improve if you have a high dex. This also is going to give you a chance for intelligence to impact your score. As a magic user, to tell you how many spells that you can learn per level. That was something that was brand new in this edition because that didn't exist in here. So prior to this, a magic user, you could have a magic user with a 3 intelligence. It wasn't recommended, but you could do it because it didn't really affect you other than it gave you penalty to your experience points because that was your prime requisite. But in here, it tells you what are your chances to learn these spells and how many do you get per level. That debuts in this supplement. So here's the section here on dexterity where it talks about fighters with a dexterity of greater than 14 can use their unusual manual dexterity to attempt to dodge or parry opponents' attacks. For every point over 14, they are able to reduce their opponent's chances of hitting them by 1. And then it says in parentheses 5%. So basically, it just, for every point over 14, you get a bonus to your armor class. So that debuted in this book, the idea that dexterity gave you a bonus or penalty on your armor class. And then, it talks over here about giving you hit die bonuses or penalties for Constitution. That was in the original rules. Okay, but here's something interesting. Statistics regarding classes, and it says additions again. Alternate hit dice and hit point accumulation, and then it says addition / amendment. This system is expressly aimed at raising fighters and lowering magic users with regard to hit points which can be sustained. This system functions as follows. For each level attained, the character gets 1 die for hit points until the top normal level is reached. Thereafter, a certain number of hit points will be added for each level above normal that is attained. So this here, with fighters having more hit dice than magic users, which have lowest. So fighters get a D8, magic users get a D4, clerics get a D6, and thieves get a D4. That came from Greyhawk. So before this, all classes had D6 hit die. And now there were different rules in here if you were using the original system and fighters, the original combat system that is, and also fighters got more. So they got at first level, they got 1 + 1. And at second level, they got 2. And swordsmen at third level, they got 3, and so on and so on. And then you see here that magic users are much lower. They get 1 at first level and then 1 + 1, meaning the +1 is just you add 1 to it. It's not another hit die. It's just +1. So they were lower, but this changed it so that every character class had a different hit die. And so that is something that, again, we're very used to today. That didn't happen until this supplement here. Okay, and then now here's another thing that's in here. Spells and level. And you see the wizard spells here go up to 9th level. How high do wizard spells go up now? 9th level. That was not always the case. Magic users, elves, whatever. It's wizards. Okay, originally in this edition of the game, magic user spells only went up to, I want to say 7th, but now I'm second guessing myself and thinking that it might be 6th. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's 6th level. Yeah. Okay. And clerics only went up to 5th level. This is going to change that so that magic users have spells available up to 9th level and clerics have spells available up to 7th level. And that 7th level cap is going to hold all the way through into Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 1st edition. And I think also in 7th, and if memory serves, it's not until 3rd edition where magic users and clerics, basically any spellcasting class has or prime spellcasting class has spells that tap out at 9th level. So that is all part of this book, something that we're very, very used to today, having wizard spells, sorcerer spells, whatever, go up to 9th level. That happened in this book, not in this book. Okay, so look how far, I mean, we're barely 10 pages in, and look at all the different things that we've talked about so far. A brand new class, rogues, adding to the core 4 of what, again, what we would consider the 4 core classes of Dungeons and Dragons, rogues or thieves, as they were called here, being added, paladins being added, half-elves being added. the idea that strength affects your ability to hit and do more damage. And that negative here, it was actually also applicable. The negatives were applicable to anybody who was fighting. The bonuses were only applicable to fighting men. That gave them an advantage. It's a reason why you wanted to be a fighter, because you got better chances to hit and do damage with high strength. The idea that dexterity affected your armor class, the idea that magic users or wizards, whatever you want to call them, that the intelligence that they had affected which spells that they could learn and how many that they could learn. That came from this book. Okay. And then the idea that different classes have different hit points, different hit die, wizard spells, magic spells going up to 9th level. Okay. All of that came from this book. And we're just, like I said, we're only 10 pages in. So that's just, to me, crazy, showing the amount of things that are changing and are being added in this particular book. Okay, so continuing on, you have your alternative combat system. And this is again, that's the system from here. I've talked about this many times, but the alternative combat system is going to become the default combat system. The original combat system was the one from Chainmail, which is not explained in this book. You basically had to buy a completely separate, you say book, but it was a separate game. You had to buy a separate game in order to use the combat system here. But if you wanted to do alternative combat system, it was explained in here, which I think explains why the alternative combat system ended up becoming the default, because it was explained how to use it in here and didn't require you to buy another book. So you have your damage by weapon type, varying amounts of damage in here, and they split it between man-sized opponents and, sorry, it's not focusing, and larger opponents. Okay, so the idea that weapons do different damage depending on how large your opponent is comes out of this book. Okay, so that's all there. Then you have the attacks and damage by monster type. So that's listed in here. And then you have your spells table. Now, let's look at this. What's in here? All these different spells. It says new spells are indicated by an asterisk. So you see magic user spells, some standard ones that you're used to here for detect magic, hold portal. All those were part of the original rules. However, look over here. Magic missile, shield, ventriloquism, darkness, 5-foot radius, strength, web, mirror image, magic mouth, pyrotechnics, explosive runes, rope trick, suggestion, monster summoning, ice storm, fear, extension, okay, legend lore, repulsion, and then all of these spells, 7th level, delayed blast, fireball, reverse gravity, limited wish, power word, stun, phase door, charm plants, mass invisibility, simulacrum, mass charm, clone, power word, blind, symbol, permanent spell, mind blank, polymorph, any object, meteor swarm, shape change, time stop, power word, kill, gate, wish, astral spell, prismatic wall, mace. All of these spells that are core to Dungeons and Dragons that are like, you can't imagine Dungeons and Dragons without magic missile. That was not in this game. It debuted in Greyhawk along with like all the power word spells, monster summoning, all of that comes out of Greyhawk. So this is what I'm talking about when I said like the way that we play the game today has so much more in common with this supplement than it does with this. So a lot of the core iconic things that you associate, that we all associate with Dungeons and Dragons, came from Greyhawk. And then same with the cleric spells. Look at the spells over here that were introduced. Snake Charm, we already talked about. Silence, Prayer, Speak with Dead. What else do we have here? All the 6th level spells are new. Animate objects, Find the Path, Blade Barrier, Word of Recall, Speak with Monsters, Conjure Animals, and then all the 7th level spells: Earthquake, Aerial Servant, Windwalk, Holy Word, Astral Spell, Symbol, Part Water, Control Weather, Raise Dead Fully, and Restoration. So all of those spells are new in this book that I just read. For people wondering why I'm reading it when I'm just showing it on the screen here, is because I've heard from a lot of folks in the comments, and it seems like there is a huge portion of people that don't watch my videos. They listen more, like they listen to it sort of almost like a podcast. And so a lot of times when I'm holding the books, I will read what's on there because I know that people are listening, not necessarily watching. But all of those spells debut in this book. So that's going to take up a huge chunk of this part of the book. There's some more artwork here by Greg Bell. That's the Ogre Magi, or what they call here the Japanese ogre. Same thing. Okay, so that's all the spells. Then we get to the monsters and treasure, and then we look at all the monsters that are going to be introduced in this book. Druids. So in this particular case, druids debut as a monster first, not as a character class. That's not going to come until 2 supplements later. Eldritch Wizardry, which is supplement 3, that's where druids are introduced as a player character option, but here they are presented as a monster. Tritons, bugbears, again, ogre magi, which again is very confusing because calling it ogre magi there, but then you have the picture here, and the picture is labeled as Japanese ogre. But like I said, it's the same thing, but I know that. But, it would be helpful if they just used the same terminology. But storm giants debut in here. Titans, shadows, will-o-wisp, liches, harpies. Dragons were already part of the game, but this is going to add new types of dragons. The metallic dragons are going to come out in here. In this book, lizardmen, doppelgangers, lycanthropes, were-rat or ratmen, lamassu, salamanders, beholders I talked about, Umber Hulks, another classic iconic D&D monster. Displacer Beast, yet another classic D&D monster that had an appearance in the D&D movie. That's how iconic that monster is. I'm talking about the recent D&D movie. Was it 2023, 2022, whenever that came out. Blink Dogs, Hellhounds, Phase Spiders, Rust Monsters, Sturges, Giant Tick, Owlbears, Carrion Crawlers, Gelatinous Cubes, Giant Slug, Homunculi, Golems. All of those are going to debut in this book. So again, I think the classic monsters that you think of, this is where the ones that are specific to D&D. And that's one thing that this book does. Greyhawk really starts to help develop I hate to keep using the word aesthetic, but that's essentially what it is. Like sort of the built-in aesthetic of what Dungeons and Dragons is, and getting it away from just being based on a combination of, for the most part, folklore, legends, or like earth-based stuff, myths and legends and mythology and folklore, but also Lord of the Rings. There was a lot of Lord of the Rings in there, of course, like the orcs and Balrogs and hobbits. Okay. So getting away just from that and starting to develop its own unique sense of what this game is. All the Beholders, there was nothing like this in any other game, any fiction, really. So those kinds of things debuting in here really start to help codify what this game is going to be about, and creating its own things that people are then in the future going to be inspired by and using in their games or fiction or comics or movies or things like that. So I'm not super well versed in Chinese mythology, but if you've seen Big Trouble in Little China and there's that floating eyeball thing that is like a spy for Lopan that's following them underground and in certain places throughout the movie, I always thought that maybe that was inspired by the Beholder. Now, again, like I said, I'm not super well versed, so that could just be a classic Chinese monster of mythology that I'm just not familiar with. But I don't know, the timing of it seems like it could have been inspired by this. Okay, so if somebody knows, again, drop that in the comments and let me know. All right, so you have all these different monsters in here, so that's going to take up a huge part of the rest of this book. And then you have all these magic items that are going to debut in here. And, a lot of these are just being added to the charts that are in here already. But lots of iconic magic items and treasures that we associate with the game are coming out of this particular book. So, just look at all of them. But you've got your swords with 9 steps draining ability, your holy sword +5, which being wielded by a paladin. That's a huge thing in this game, is that paladins can use that. Your dragon slaying swords, your cursed swords, your dancing swords, your armor and shield of missile attraction, your various weapons, arrows of slaying, crossbow of speed. Again, just on and on of all these things that we just kind of take for granted as having been part of the game from the very beginning, but they weren't. They were debuting in this particular book. The Rod of Rulership, the Rod of Resurrection, even down here, Medallions of Thought Projection. So these have just been part and parcel of the game from this book. Okay, so that's kind of like the main next part of this, what I wanted to talk about, and the gist of what I wanted to focus on was all of that. And then these are things that I don't know that necessarily they've had a lasting impact on the game as much as just this is my favorite part of this entire supplement. More so than thieves, more so than paladins or half elves or the new spells, any of that, were these ideas for dungeon masters. Tricks and traps, additions, giant bubbles which float about in corridors and rooms of the dungeon. The slightest touch will explode them, causing from 1 to 10 dice of damage, depending on what level that you're on. And I just love that kind of stuff. I loved those tricks and traps, and I'm going to go through some more in just a second here. Now, the legacy that this kind of stuff has, these underworld and wilderness adventures, editions of these traps, is that this is really giving dungeon masters an idea of like how to run this game and do things to challenge their players, which this doesn't really do. These 3 books don't necessarily get into that. This is mostly mechanics based as far as like the statistics of the classes and how to generate ability scores and that kind of thing. There is advice in the underworld and wilderness adventures section, which is book 3, but this really gets more into like the creativity side of like how to mix and match things to like I said, challenge your players. And so I do like this. And so a lot of these weird rooms that you're getting, like rooms which emit rays or gases which cause unexpected reactions or force players entering to do things that they would not necessarily do. So maybe it causes you to all attack each other, that kind of thing. So that kind of stuff, that's the kind of stuff that my perception is that those types of things were sort of inspired by Rob Kuntz, a lot of them, and that his style of running the game. So I talked last time when I was mentioning module S3 expedition to the area to the barrier peak. So that was in my video on the top 10 adventures from TSR, like a top 10 D&D or AD&D adventures during the TSR era, and I included S3 expedition to the barrier peaks. And I mentioned how Rob Kuntz had a machine level that he had designed in Greyhawk. So when I hear stuff like this, that just reminds me of that, like these rooms that, you've got buttons and rays and see, it says devices which have numbers of levers, buttons, or dials, and the movement of each will cause different things to happen. I sort of feel like that was probably, taken from that stuff that Rob Kuntz had done, perhaps even more so than Gary. But I really like this. So doors which will only open for monsters, doors which allow traffic into an area but not out of it, doors which have intelligence. Really, really kind of fun ideas. And by the way, if you didn't see that video yet on my top 10 D&D modules, I would check it out. It's by far my most popular video out of my last 10. It's about double of the next highest video, which was the top 10 weird things about original D&D. So if you don't watch the channel a lot, I know that those 2 are in the top, but I don't really do top 10 videos. And those, I think, are my only 2 on the channel. Maybe I have a third one that was done last year, but for whatever reason, top 10 videos just do well. And in that one, I got top 10 lists from some other YouTubers and put them into my video so we could compare and contrast our choices. Okay, so this just goes on and on of all these different ideas that you have. And then you have your monstrous tricks and combination monsters editions. And again, this was, if I had to pick a single page out of this whole book that I return back to often, it's this page right here. Animals which appear perfectly harmless but are deadly, such as oxen which are crossbred with gorgons, or small lizards which are able to breathe fire, creatures which grow to huge size if approached too closely, or animals which turn to some horde monster if touched are typical examples. And then it says a giant with faces or multiple heads which can never be surprised, and with 4 additional eyes it's able to see invisible and hidden objects and coordinate no less than 2 attacks. Giants known as rock giants, which so closely resemble stone that they can be determined, or detected seldom. Fire-resistant mummies, because your players get used to burning them. Skeletons, which hurl their finger joints as if they were magic arrows. I love that idea as a kid. I still love it. I think it's a very clever idea. Monsters which are an endless supply due a magical point of origin. Greyhawk had a fountain on the 2nd level which issued endless numbers of snakes. And then they have all these things that you put together, like maybe there's a frost giant riding a white dragon, or a troll with a magic spear riding a purple worm, or an evil high priest riding a chimera, or I loved this one, Mars mounted on Talos' shoulders. Doesn't even tell you what that means. but just mixing those together. And then these really diabolical ones, like an ogre jelly, which appears to be a mere ogre, but it's really like an ogre jelly, or a snake, which is actually a gray ooze, or a giant spider like black pudding. So, I mean, just things just totally unexpected for your players. So I love that kind of stuff. Again, as far as those ideas showing up in future editions, not really, but it's more just about this idea of like teaching DMs to be creative with these rules and take it and make it their own, and doing things that aren't necessarily explained in the rules, which means you have to figure out how it works. None of this stuff, especially like if you wanted to make the ogre jelly, you just have to figure out the stats for that and just make it work, right? So I thought that was really cool. I love that kind of stuff. More drawings here. There's your first bugbear. In case anyone wants to know what a bugbear is, it's this guy with the pumpkin head. So probably a little different looking than your standard bugbear that you've heard or seen in Dungeons and Dragons. There's the first owl bear right there. It's a drawing by Greg Bell. These are all by Greg Bell here. So that's it. And then you get your corrections. This is your errata of things that's correcting all of the things that were, mistakes or things that they needed to change from the original rules. So things like dwarves get +1 to hit, and they subtract -1 from chances to be hit when fighting the giant class. It puts that in parentheses or in quotes, and it never tells you what giant class is. You just have to figure out what monsters qualify as giant class. And then you've got your beholders in here and alternative combat system, all this kind of stuff, right? So that's all additions and corrections. So a lot of that came because this was a later printing. Like I said, this is a 10th printing. So they've already figured out that there were mistakes made on stuff that was introduced in this book, including, as I said, like beholders, golems, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's kind of my look at how this book impacted the way that we play D&D today. So if you're new, again, to 5th edition, you probably recognize a lot of the stuff that's in here, and more so than you would recognize, like I said, stuff that was in the original rules. So, of course, the core of the game is in here, but a lot of the iconic stuff that we associate with the game came from this supplement, more so than any other supplement, more so than Blackmoor, and more so than Eldritch Wizardry. And there is stuff in those two supplements, and I might talk about them later. If that's something you want to see me cover, leave a note below and let me know. But as far as the fundamental additions and changes to the game, it's this supplement right here, Greyhawk. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. And I know it's a little bit quicker than some of my other ones. I am trying to, a combination of things. I'm trying to speak a little bit quicker, not too fast, but I want to hold people's attention. And I know that like a 2-hour video is a huge time commitment. So my last video that I did for the top 10 modules, it did eke out just slightly under 2 hours, which was not my intent when I started making it. But, I had videos from other folks in there that added to it. And I wanted to cover a lot about those modules, the creators and why I like them and what you could expect if you were to run those. So, but I know that I know that 2 hours and even an hour long is too long for YouTube. YouTube really wants you sub 10 minutes. That is not my channel. So if that's the kind of stuff you're looking for, this is not really going to be the place. But I'm trying to kind of bring the time limit down a little bit to give people a break and hopefully help more people to discover my channel, because I know a lot of folks probably see like a 2-hour video about D&D, and unless you're a real kind of history buff about this kind of stuff, you might be turned off. And I'm hoping to try to bring some folks in. I have seen my subscriber count has definitely slowed a lot in the past 6 months versus I'm getting about half the number of subscribers per month that I used to get. And that makes a huge difference to me, because I'm trying to grow my channel and expose more people to this history of Dungeons and Dragons and where the game came from, and how the changes made in the past affect the way that people play the game today. So the more people I can get that message out to, the better. So making small changes like slightly shorter videos, I'm hoping will help that. But in any event, for those of you who did stick around through all of this or who've been with the channel for a long time, I really do appreciate your support. Thank you so much for watching this video, and let me know what you think about it in the comments below. Let me know your exposure or your history with Greyhawk, whether you use it. Maybe you're one of those players that only uses the original 3 books and you don't like Greyhawk at all. And I'd love to hear from you as well and why that is. Did you ever use Greyhawk, or did you just look at it and decide that it wasn't for you? And I also want to hear from folks who only know D&D post Greyhawk, which I assume is probably most of you, considering this came out in 1975. So you have a different, version of the game, or a different vision of the game, because a lot of the stuff that I just mentioned here has been part of the game probably since you started playing, and maybe you didn't know that it came from this book, not from the original rules. So I'd love to hear from you as well. So just leave all of that in the comments below, and then while you're down there, you'll find places where you can join me on social media: Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, etc. You'll find links to my blog. You'll find links to my shop where you can buy something to help support my channel, such as a hoodie, t-shirt, mug, poster, or notebook with exclusive tabletop role-playing game designs that you can only find at my shop. So that's a great way to help support the channel, as is becoming a super fan if you have the means to do that. So just hit that little heart icon with the $sign in it underneath the video description. And if you can contribute, I would really appreciate it, because it does really help. So I just took the plunge and decided to literally just like during breaks while I was uploading videos from my phone to my laptop, to buy a new laptop. My laptop is dying. It makes this grinding noise all the time while it's on because the fan's busted. And it takes forever to upload my videos from my phone to my laptop. And it takes a long time to edit because my computer's just old and slow. It's about 7 years old, I think, at this point. So I just decided to buy a new laptop. And partly the reason I was able to do that was from you kind folks who have been supporting my channel, again, through visiting my shop or becoming a super fan. So thank you so much for that. And hopefully in the new year, you'll notice maybe the videos will look better, but at the very least, I think it should take me less time to make them, which maybe means I can make more videos more than just once a week. So thank you so much for your support with all of that. And with all that being said, I'd like to thank you so very much for watching this video. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I will talk to you next time. Okay, now for the bonus content, what I was drinking and what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. So today is Monday, December 2nd. So in my household, starting the day after Thanksgiving is when we start to celebrate Christmas. So it's when we put away our fall decorations. We put out our Christmas decorations, or start to. We're still in the process because we have a lot. And that's the day that we, officially start listening to Christmas music. My wife and daughter will sometimes do it before Thanksgiving, but for me, I just have a personal rule. I won't listen to Christmas music until the day after Thanksgiving. So now this year I was also working at my friend's shop, my friend's record store, for the Black Friday RSD event. So that took up a whole day, but it was really fun. So anyway, so for the next few weeks in my videos for this bonus content, I am going to be talking about Christmas albums, because when else am I going to talk about them? And I have quite a few, got a pretty big selection, because it's just something I enjoy. So hopefully you guys will be okay with that. I know there's a lot of people that, either hate Christmas music, or they just don't celebrate the holiday at all, or anything like that. So I hear you. I know that you're out there, and so I apologize if this part isn't really for you, but maybe you'll find something that you dig. But first off, let's talk about the drink. So I mentioned today's December 2nd. So today is the 220th anniversary of when Napoleon installed himself as Emperor of France in 1804, and his wife Josephine as Empress. And so my friends and my friend who owns the record shop, and he's sober actually, and then my other friend who is the dad player in the D&D group that I talk about, the game that I run for my daughter and her friends, he's the one dad player. The three of us started a project during the pandemic lockdowns that we call Cocktail Cadre. We have a website where we just talk about the craft of making cocktails at home, and how you can take time and measure and do things precisely. And it really doesn't take that much longer than, using a mix out of a bottle or whatnot. And so I wanted to talk about that a little bit, because we created this cocktail for that website. So this is something that we just call the Josephine Bonaparte. And it is actually just a riff on a 50-50 martini. So if you're not aware, 50-50 martini it's half and half vermouth and gin. So I know a lot of people don't like to put vermouth in their martinis, and a lot of you will drink vodka martinis. So I was at a bar the other day, and this guy ordered a Kettle One martini on the rocks, hold the vermouth. And my favorite bartender was helping him, as she always does. And so when she stepped out for a second, I turned to the guy, and I was just chatting with him, and I said, "So just so you know, you just ordered a glass of cold Kettle One vodka on the rocks." And he said, "Yeah, that's how I order my martinis." And I said, "Well, the thing is, you just paid the upcharge for a martini because you ordered it that way. If all you want is cold vodka, just order vodka on the rocks. And most places that will be cheaper than ordering in a martini." So also, nomenclature matters. I've talked about this before, but a martini is not a style of drink. It is a name. It's a proper name, and it is made with gin and vermouth and usually orange bitters with either a lemon twist or an olive. If you put the olive in, you leave out the orange bitters. So what people call vodka martini is properly actually called a kangaroo. You're never going to see, not never, you almost will never see it called that. A very high-end cocktail bar will call it a kangaroo. But just kind of learn these things. So if you enjoy vodka, I particularly don't. It's not for me. But if vodka is something you like, don't pay the upcharge. If you're going to leave the vermouth out, just order vodka. Okay. But so a 50-50 martini is half vermouth, half gin. And this is a riff on that. However, it replaces the vermouth with white wine. Now, we saw this recipe somewhere else, and then we kind of riffed on it some more. So the original recipe, it was still 50-50. And we tried it with half gin, half white wine, and we did not like it at all. So we got a French gin, Citadelle. Citadelle, I forget the name. I'll put it in the show notes. But we wanted a French gin because we're celebrating all things France today. And then we got a French white wine, a Sancerre. And so that's what we used, but we did 2-to-1. So 2-to-1 gin to white wine. And then for some extra little punch of flavor, we added, in addition to the lemon peel, as you see here, we also added some citrus bitters and some lavender bitters. So just really quick, these are my lavender bitters. And this came in a little sampler case. And you see this little dropper here. So if a recipe calls for 2 dashes, 1 drop is about 1/8 of a dash. So 8 drops, equals a dash. So I put, in this case, we only put 1 dash of lavender because lavender can be very, very overpowering. It can make your drink taste like soap. So you have to use it very sparingly. But the mixing that with the citrus bitters and then the white wine was quite delightful. So cheers. And the reason why we made a cocktail is to celebrate the 220th installation of Napoleon as the Emperor of France. Is the idea is that a lot of people feel that they need an occasion to have a drink. I don't think that. I think if you together with friends or family and you want to make a cocktail before dinner or have a cocktail hour or a post-dinner cocktail, that's fine. Just do that, within moderation. Always be careful and know your limits. But some people want an event or an occasion. And so we've started listing random occasions that you can use as, I want to say, an excuse, but sort of just like for inspiration to help you celebrate and have a cocktail. Bring back the sophistication and the civility of cocktail hour. So cheers, everyone. And salute, all those things. I really like the addition of the wine to that, but definitely didn't work as 50-50, at least not to us. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's talk about the album I was listening to. So I got this from my best friend, the one that owns the record shop, but he bought this for me years ago before he owned the shop. This is Ray Charles, The Spirit of Christmas. This is from 1985. Now, if you've ever seen Christmas Vacation, National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, there's a scene where Clark Griswold is up in the attic. He gets trapped up there because someone closes the door, and he digs out his old movie reels, and he starts looking at his own home videos of when he was celebrating Christmas as a kid, and there's a song playing, and that song is The Spirit of Christmas, which is the title track of this album, even though it doesn't come on until about halfway through, a little bit more than halfway through. But this is a mix of mostly standards, but also some original songs such as that one. And this is definitely the best track off the album. And it's just a fun album. Ray Charles is fun. I featured Ray Charles here before in the bonus content. I enjoy listening to him. And I'm trying to show you some Christmas albums that you might not be aware of and just, help you get out of the rut. A lot of people say they don't like Christmas music, and it's because they just hear the same songs over and over and over and over and over and over again every year on the radio. But it's so much more than that. And you can find so many little gems if you just spend a little bit of time. So this is the original pressing that came out in 85. However, they have done a repressing within the past few years, which also made it cheaper to get the original. This was expensive when my friend got it because they hadn't repressed it since it came out. But now that there is a repressing, you can also get like a nice new clean copy that will play great and is a lot cheaper than trying to dig out an original pressing. So that's going to be it for my music section here. So I hope you enjoyed the bonus section. Let me know if you've ever heard this album. If you like it, also drop into the comments some of your favorite Christmas albums. I love collecting and listening to Christmas music. So maybe you have a favorite that I want to add to my collection. I'd love to hear about that. So let me know. But in the meantime, cheers, everybody. Thanks again for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.